When I was rushed into the operating room, I thought I would see my parents' worried faces or maybe feel Ethan's hand in mine. But none of them were there. Instead, my family and boyfriend were cheering on my foster sister Sophie as she competed in a dance event. My surgery didn't go as planned. While the tumor in my brain was successfully removed, the nerves surrounding it were severely damaged. I survived, but I lost the ability to feel physical sensations like a normal person. As I lay recovering in the cold hospital room, I typed out a message in our family group chat. I wanted to tell them. I wanted to scream. I just had brain surgery. I almost died, but I deleted it because I knew. Even if I said something, none of them would truly care. To them, Sophie was the sun. I was just a shadow. Sophie wasn't born into our family. She was the daughter of my father's comrade. When she was 6, her parents died in a car crash. Driven away by uncaring relatives, she ended up on the streets, dirty, barefoot, and hungry. My father, visiting an old friend, found her and brought her home. I was 10 years old when Sophie entered our lives. That night, my parents sat me down and said, "Ava, you're growing up now. You need to learn how to take care of your sister." Sister, that's what they called her. From the beginning, Sophie didn't need to fight for anything. She just had to stand there, wide-eyed with trembling lips. Every time she looked at me, it felt like she was silently claiming my world as hers. At 10, I lost my bedroom. I was moved into the cold guest room. At 12, my piano lessons were canceled, and our family piano, my only joy, was sold. That empty room, it became Sophie's private dance studio. By 15, I stopped wearing new clothes altogether. I rotated between 2 faded school uniforms. My parents didn't notice. Or maybe they did, they just didn't care. Sophie, meanwhile, wore beautiful dresses. My parents paraded her around, proudly calling her their pretty daughter. That was when I began spending more time away from home. Years passed. When I was about to graduate college, Sophie went abroad to study dance. Out of nowhere, started calling again. They sent me job listings from their city, trying to sound involved like they cared. But it wasn't about me. My father said, with pride swelling in his chest, that by sending my comrade's daughter to college, I fulfilled my duty. He even said he would come visit to evaluate my long-term boyfriend, Ethan. I had long stopped expecting anything from them. Still, I booked their hotel, made dinner reservations, and waited politely. What I didn't expect was that they brought Sophie with them, and that the entire dinner Sophie would smile at Ethan, just like she did when she first arrived in our home. That dinner should have just been a reunion, but I noticed it, the way Sophie's eyes never left Ethan, the way he smiled back, absent-mindedly brushing his hair like he used to when he was nervous around me. A few nights later, just before I was rushed into surgery, I opened Ethan's chat. At the top of his messages was a pinned profile picture, Megan, and below it, a flight ticket. Same destination as Sophie's competition. Still, I couldn't let go. Tay called my parents one last time before surgery. The line connected for 3 seconds, just long enough to hear my mother's voice. "Sarah, we're boarding now. Your sister's competition is crucial. We'll talk when we get back, okay?" Click, the call ended. I stared at my phone in disbelief. My heart didn't break. It just froze. That night, my aunt sat beside me. She had come all the way from another city when she found out about my condition. As the nurses prepared the anesthesia, she gently squeezed my hand. "He signed the consent form for you," she whispered. "Don't worry, I'll be right here. You've endured enough." As I slipped into unconsciousness, I wondered, if I died on this table, would anyone mourn me? I woke up from surgery, alive, but different. I could move, breathe, even speak, but I felt numb. Not just physically, emotionally too. It was like someone had erased all the colors from my world. My aunt was there the entire time. She peeled apples by my bedside, cracked silly jokes, told stories to ease the silence. She noticed the change in me right away. "You're so quiet," she said, brushing my hair gently. But then she paused. "Still, something's missing in your eyes." And she was right. That deep yearning I always carried, for my parents' affection, for Ethan's love, was gone. When I was discharged, doctors asked if I felt anything unusual. I looked them in the eyes and said calmly, "I've never felt better." It was true in a way. I could think clearly for the first time. My emotions no longer clouded my judgment. I saw things for what they were. My parents didn't love me. Alex, the man I had loved for 4 years, had fallen for my sister. And I had been nothing more than a placeholder. We had once built a company together. He was the face. I was the hands behind the curtain. He got the credit and I did the work. One day after returning from the hospital, I walked into my apartment and found them all there. My parents, Sophie, and Alex. They had just returned from their overseas trip, laughing and celebrating Sophie's new award. No one had called to ask how my surgery went. No one noticed I hadn't been home. Sophie skipped toward me, her voice sweet and innocent. Sarah! I hope you don't mind, but Alex and I were thinking of celebrating my win here, just like old times. For a moment, I almost nodded out of habit. The obedient daughter, the understanding girl. But then, something snapped. I stepped back and gently pushed Sophie's hand away. She gasped. She wasn't used to rejection. Tears instantly welled in her eyes as if I had struck her. My father narrowed his eyes. Sarah, what's wrong with you? He barked. Alex remained quiet. My mother, she stood there silent as ever, watching me crumble beneath their words, until my aunt came down the stairs with my suitcase. She took my hand and said, loud and clear, we're leaving. My father scowled. Oh, where are you going? I turned around, looked him dead in the eyes and replied, from now on, my only family is my aunt. For the first time in years, I walked away from my family without looking back. My mother called after me, her voice trembling, Sarah. Where are you going? What do you mean you're never coming home again? But I didn't answer. Not anymore. That night, I told them the truth. About the surgery. About the consent form. About how they weren't even there when I almost died. My mother turned ghostly pale. She stammered, why didn't you tell us? We didn't know it was that serious. My aunt spoke up, her voice calm but cutting. I called. Many times, you picked up, you just didn't have the patience to listen. Their silence was louder than any apology. When my mother finally tried to reach out, I had already blocked her. And my father, and Ethan, and Sophie, they were furious, of course. In the family group chat, they called me petty, jealous of Sophie's success. But my aunt didn't let it slide. She uploaded my medical reports, photos of me in a hospital bed. The legal documents she signed when my parents didn't even bother to show up. Where were you when your daughter needed you most? She wrote. They didn't reply. That night, my aunt stayed by my side again. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered, you've done nothing wrong, Sarah. Let it out. You don't have to hold everything in anymore. But I didn't cry. I wasn't sad. I didn't feel grief. Not anger. Not regret. Nothing. Whatever was left inside me had long since been carved out. The next time I saw them, I didn't feel fear or pain. I felt nothing. They were waiting outside my company building, my parents, Sophie, and Alex, who hadn't shown his face in 2 weeks. He looked like he wanted to speak, but when our eyes met, he looked away. Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling, her eyes red from tears. Sarah, Megan's been diagnosed with depression. The doctor says she needs emotional support, and we thought, my mother cut in sharper than ever. You're her sister. You have to help her. You can't just let her career fall apart, can you? I stood there, listening to their carefully staged guilt trip. Sophie had gained some fame. They had invested everything into her. I understood. What I didn't understand was how they still thought I would bend. So I answered calmly, fine, I'll support her. But I want 15% of the original company shares, compensation for the years I gave to you, the years you took from me. Alex's face darkened. Sophie gasped. But I didn't stop. Once the paperwork is signed, I'll disappear. You won't need to invite me to the wedding. I won't return. I won't speak about your relationship, Sophie. Ever. But if you want my silence, pay for it. Sophie clung to Alex's arm, crying. And Alex, he agreed. He agreed because he was desperate. Because the public image of their golden couple couldn't be tarnished. I already owned 26% of the company. Years ago, I had bought back another 10% from Alex in secret. Now, with this new agreement, I became the majority shareholder. While Alex and Sophie clung to the illusion of love, I held the reins of everything we built. I immediately called my legal team, had the contracts drafted, notarized, and filed by the end of the day. Then I looked Sophie in the eyes, smiled, and said, you have the funds now. Try not to cling to Alex too tightly. And I signaled for security to escort them out. As security guided them away, my mother emerged from the back. Her voice cracked as she stared at me. What do you mean you're never coming home again? I didn't respond. She grabbed my arm and shouted, Are you trying to kill me? Look at what you're doing to your own mother. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't feel guilt. Her old tricks, her sobs, her collapsing knees, the feigned illness, none of it worked anymore. I looked at her calmly and said, In the future, you and your family should live well without me. That shook her, even more than my silence. My father, who had said nothing until now, lunged at me, eyes blazing with fury. But the guard stepped in, blocking his path. He clutched his chest, his breath heavy. He wasn't used to being powerless. That day, even my cousin, Megan's younger brother, tried to guilt me. Sarah, you can hate me, but your aunt and uncle are still your biological parents. What you're doing is too much. Too much? Too much? Had they forgotten everything? I ignored him. Picked up my phone. Focused on company matters. Alex stepped forward then, clearly uncomfortable. Sarah, we should talk. I met his eyes and interrupted. There's nothing left to discuss. You can keep your money, but we're done. His eyes widened. Panic flickered. The company, Sarah, I cut him off again. Your unexplained absence for 2 weeks, your betrayal, your silence, none of it inspires trust. We've voted. You're no longer CEO. Then, right in front of him, I pulled out my phone and blocked his number. I turned and walked away as he stood frozen in place, disbelief etched on his face. Alex once prided himself on control. But I had taken back everything. Not long after reclaiming my shares, I bought a house. Not for me, for my aunt. I moved her out of the cramped old neighborhood and into a warm, quiet home in the heart of the city. When I handed her the deed with her name on it, she hesitated. I don't need this, Sarah. I just want you to be happy. But I insisted. This is your home. No one can take it from you. Ever again. I leaned my head on her shoulder, something I hadn't done since I was a child. I'll live with you from now on, okay? Don't reject me. Her hands trembled as she held me close. It's okay. As long as I'm here, you'll always have a home. For the first time in years, I believed it. When my parents heard I had bought a new house for my aunt, they were furious. They drove to our gated community, but security didn't let them pass the entrance. Not without permission. Not anymore. My father called my aunt and exploded with insults, blaming her for ruining his daughter. She listened silently, and then asked one question. If Sarah's really your daughter, where is her room in your house? Her clothes? Her pictures? Her place at the table? He had no answer, because there wasn't one. I hugged my aunt from behind as she hung up the phone. I remembered that freezing winter night years ago, walking miles through snow without a coat, because there was no food or warmth waiting for me at home. But when I reached her gate, my aunt was there, taking out the trash under an umbrella. She saw me, ran to me, held me. Since that day, her house became my home. She bought me dishes, a bed, even the piano my parents had once sold, which now sat quietly in her living room. I couldn't even play anymore, but I made a silent vow. From now on, I will be the one to protect her. The house I bought was more than just a gift to my aunt. It was a wall, a boundary between me and the people who used to control my life. But of course, they couldn't stay away. My parents tried everything to reach me. They called, showed up uninvited, even followed me from a distance. I ignored them for 3 days. Then, when I had enough evidence, I reported them for harassment. They were detained for 15 days. Yes, the same parents who once demanded respect and obedience from me now sat in a police station. Furious, humiliated, powerless, they screamed at me in front of the officers, accusing me of being unfilial, ungrateful, cold. But I simply put in my earplugs and turned to the officer mediating the case. And no, I don't want to reconcile. And yes, I'm pressing charges. When they were finally released, they were no longer furious. They were afraid. My father, once strict, intimidating, unshakable, called my name over and over again as I left. Sarah. Sora, it sounded like a plea. I didn't turn around. A few days later, I heard they were living with Alex. Of course, he welcomed them at first, out of guilt, out of obligation. But after weeks of their arrogance, complaints, and manipulation, even Alex reached his limit. He moved them into a tiny apartment far away from his home. That distance, physical and emotional, sparked chaos. They blamed Megan, who had convinced them Alex was their future. But now Mem was growing distant too, trying to preserve what was left of her relationship with Alex. Eventually, everything began to crack. Megan visited her parents' apartment one day and overheard them bad-mouthing Alex. She exploded, breaking things, screaming, finally showing her rage. She shouted at my mother, "You treat me like a puppet. I was never enough, was I?" My mother, shocked, struck her across the face. My father sat in the corner, smoking silently. Neighbors gathered. Cameras rolled. The story that once seemed like a perfect family collapsed publicly. Later, a relative who used to mock me sent a message. "Sarah, your aunt really picked the right one. You're the true daughter." But my aunt scoffed. They called her a wild child for years. Now they want to praise her? I smiled faintly, watching the worry in her eyes under the warm kitchen light. A few strands of white hair glinted beneath it. I reached out, held her hand, and said softly, "Don't be angry, Aunt." He was wrong. You didn't choose the right child. I'm just lucky to have met you. Her eyes turned red as she whispered, "Don't be silly. I'm your aunt. Loving you is only natural." Life began to shift quickly after that. I poured myself into work. The company thrived, our revenue soared, and I expanded operations internationally. Strangely enough, Alex's parents, the ones who once disapproved of me, started sending me invitations to business events, clearly trying to mend fences. And Alex? He tried reaching out several times. I never answered. One night, at a formal business gala hosted by a key partner, I saw him again. He wore a well-fitted suit, hair styled immaculately, but the pride he once carried had vanished. The stress was written all over his face. Supporting an entire family, carrying Megan's failed dreams, and dealing with my parents' toxic presence had drained him. When our eyes met across the room, I could see that he recognized the power dynamic had changed. Before, I had clung to him. Now, he was the one shrinking under the weight of our past. Trying to appear composed, Alex approached me later that evening. "Sarah, you've become so successful now. I almost don't recognize you," he said, voice low and unsure. He apologized for everything, confessing that he never truly loved Megan, that he had projected his lost ambitions onto her, that she was just a mirror reflecting the boldness he lacked. "After losing you," he whispered, he realized what I truly lost. I let him speak, but inside, I felt nothing. Eventually, I stood up and cut him off. "Alex, no matter how poetic your regrets sound, you still cheated. You still threw me aside. You're shameless to even show your face to me now." That night, I confirmed what I had suspected for a while. The man I once admired wasn't worth it. I had surpassed him in every way. A few weeks later, I heard the inevitable: Alex and Megan were back together. Because of course, there's no such thing as just one betrayal. People like that always return to what's familiar, even if it destroys them. But this time, their relationship was different. The rose-tinted filter was gone. Alex had started to abuse Megan, both verbally and physically. He no longer saw her as a delicate dreamer. He called her names, insulted her, tore her down daily. He resented her for dragging him into a pit of financial and emotional ruin, and she clung to him out of desperation. Meanwhile, my parents, having exhausted their savings and tarnished their reputation, reconciled for one last time. My mother claimed she was pregnant, an unexpected late-in-life child, and used it as a reason to drop her divorce plans. She even welcomed Megan back into their family, choosing once again to ignore the cost of doing so. Then one stormy night, I received a call. It was my father, panicked and breathless. "Sarah, your mother fell. She's bleeding everywhere. Please come help. She raised you for 20 years. His voice trembled, the manipulation laced in every word. I didn't hesitate. I calmly called an ambulance and arranged for emergency responders to head their way. My aunt stood beside me, anxious. She offered to come with me. But I shook my head. "I'm not a doctor," I said. "I won't be of any help there." Later that night, my phone buzzed again. A string of text messages lit up the screen. The last one read, "I'm sorry. I'm not worthy to be your mother. Please take care of yourself and your aunt. Don't come here." And then, silence. The next morning, the police called. There had been a fire at my parents' old home. They found 4 bodies. My parents, Megan and Alex, all deceased. Autopsies revealed they had all been drugged with sleeping pills before the fire was set. It was no accident. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't feel anything at all. But my aunt, who stood by my side, had tears in her eyes. She held me close and whispered, "I'm still here, Sarah. I'll always be your family." And in that moment, I realized I didn't lose anything in that fire. I had already lost it all long ago. What remained was what I had built, and who had stayed. The truth came quietly a few days after the fire. Before she died, she wrote me a letter, one final message the police found in her pocket. The paper was wrinkled, tear-stained. "Sarah, if there's a next life, let me be a better mother. I'll seek redemption for what I did to you. Don't come here. Take care of yourself and your aunt."